So Bleak Faith Forsaken has made it to home consoles, both for PS5 and for Xbox Series X. And I think when it first released, there was a lot of criticism about whether or not this is a game that could eventually evolve into something that was worthy of the home consoles. When I did my initial impressions of Bleak Faith Forsaken, I said in that video that I thought in a year or so that there was going to be tremendous progress with this game. My guess is that a year from now, 2 years from now, this game looks and plays and feels very different than it does currently. I am happy to report that there has been a ton of progress with Bleak Faith Forsaken. The question for today is it ready for home consoles? So that's what we're going to dig into. The first thing that you cannot ignore, I'm going to show the end credits of Bleak Faith Forsaken. And this little bit up here, the little bit with the 3 names, that is the 3 people who made this game and continue to develop it. So it's literally a 3-person crew that created this game. The rest of the list on the credits is just voice actors and special thanks to some content creators and some other folks that had some kind of influence. That's it for the entire game. Now, does that mean that it's okay to put out a game that's crap? Well, no, of course not. But what I want to underscore here is that from the time that Bleak Faith Forsaken first released, these developers have not stopped working on the game. They have released countless updates that have made huge improvements to get it to the point for PlayStation and Xbox to release it on their stores for their home consoles is quite an achievement. Now, I guess it's not saying everything because they've allowed some pretty bad garbage to get into their stores, but it is a positive statement. So first, when I heard that it was coming to consoles, I decided to jump back into the PC version of the game to see how much progress was there and if they had gotten it to the point where home consoles made sense. And I ended up playing it from start to finish, all the way through to the end, and beating the game along with every boss in the game. And I had a really good time with it. There are definitely some things that are still a little rough around the edges, but it is a much more cohesive, much more enjoyable experience than when it first released. Now, there were so many issues when it first released, and I think the main thing that created those issues was that this team is very ambitious. They think, well, can we do that? And if we can, let's try to put it in. So some things that were corrected from the initial release, first and foremost, is the controller support. Now it is fully plug and play on the PC. They give you a few different presets for the profiles, and it works far, far better than it did before. Before, you'd have to pull the sensitivity all the way down to pretty much 0, and otherwise you're going to go flying off of cliffs and have very little control over your character. The other thing that they've done, which was much improved, is the overall movement, including dashing, dodging, jumping. There was a floatiness, a lack of control to the original release of the game that's really been tightened up quite a bit. There are now some sections that have some pretty precise platforming that I think are very doable and very manageable, and it doesn't feel like a crapshoot whether or not you're going to make the jump. You just have to line it up right, and it's pretty predictable with how it responds. This was something that was kind of worrisome thinking about an eventual console port. Frame rates would be really sporadic in certain sections of the game. Between a combination of loading levels and different lighting effects, and this game has a ton of lighting effects, and some of them maybe go a little overboard, I think it was a lot on the PC side to handle, and it would have been a lot for the consoles, but they've made some smart decisions when it comes to that. So the way they've gotten around those loading sections where you're going in between areas is now they do have a very brief loading screen between areas. They ask you if you're ready to move to the next area, and then you say yes, and then there's a quick load screen, and then you're into the next area. This is a fair compromise because if you played the original game and you walked through those areas, you wouldn't know what was happening. All of a sudden your computer would start tripping out and it would stutter, and if you happen to like walk backwards, it would do it again because you're crossing those thresholds of loading zones. So while this isn't ideal overall, you'd like that fully interconnected world without the loading zones. I can totally deal with it because I understand the problem that they fixed by putting these in. Another thing that they fixed is the overall quality of the enemies. Now, not all enemies were bad, but they had a tendency to have enemies that just teleported up to you that looked pretty poor overall in terms of their visual fidelity, and some that had some pretty wonky animations and sound effects, which they've pretty much done away with. Almost everything in the game now looks like a legitimate enemy looks like a legitimate NPC, but certainly greatly improved from the original enemies that were in the game. Another big fix has been clipping. In the original review that I put out, I talked about how there were some giants that would actually walk straight through buildings and they would constantly clip. Now, there is still some clipping, but it's much improved. They definitely do have boundaries where they have to fit through, and sometimes you can use doorways to your benefit now because of how those walls are working. So that is definitely another thing that is a big improvement for Bleak Faith Forsaken. The other thing that really makes a difference in the game is the lighting effects and how they approached it. So in the original release, the game was so dark you would have to jack up the gamma to the max in order for people to be able to see what the heck was going on in the game for large portions of it. And then you'd have other sections which were completely blown out, nothing but white light everywhere, and you really couldn't tell what was going on. And they've kind of toned it down a little bit. But what they did to compensate for this is now they've created these extra items that you can pick up, which are post-processing effects that you can then apply to your game if you'd like to see how it looks. This is both on the PC and PS5 versions of the game. I assume Xbox Series X as well. In terms of the overall gameplay and the combat is still similar to release, but it does feel much better. It seems like the hitboxes have been kind of trimmed down and do match up with what the actual enemy is doing for the most part. And it is a little more satisfying in terms of the overall feel of weapons, hitting enemies, that sort of thing. There still is kind of an odd sound effect of it sounds like a shovel hitting dirt, like someone's digging for a lot of the sharp weapons. But for the most part, it's definitely a big improvement over the original release of the game, and I do think it's gotten to the point where it is certainly tolerable and much improved. Now, there are some things that I think it's very important to know about Bleak Faith Forsaken heading into it. The first is, unfortunately, the first zones, the first levels are the worst in the game. They're not bad, but they feel kind of drab. They don't have a lot of dynamic things going on, a lot of dynamic enemies, and they're very large. So when you're traveling through them, they can feel kind of monotonous. It can feel like it's taking you a long time to get anywhere, to get any kind of progress, but it definitely picks up steam towards the mid game and the end game. Areas become crazier and crazier, enemies become crazier and crazier, but there are a lot of innovative things that are in Bleak Faith Forsaken that you honestly won't see until hour 3, 4, 5 of playing the game. A couple of things to look forward to are there is an underwater section of the game, there is swimming, there are some things in that water that you may or may not want to be messing with. There are sections of the game where you're interacting with other creatures, including a sky area, where there's a very large creature you can actually jump on to take you through the level. It's a little wonky how that works, but it's still a really cool thing that I really haven't seen in other Souls-likes or action RPGs like this. And there are a lot of effects to the game when you get to certain areas that are very stylized and very cool. But again, you won't see these until you've invested some time into the game. So know that going into it if you end up purchasing the game. The beginning is unfortunately the worst part of it. It's not bad, but it will take some time to get the ball rolling. And once it does get rolling, that's when things pick up. That's when it starts feeling better. Since I played through the whole thing on PC and I did enjoy my playthrough, I decided, you know what, I do have to go ahead and purchase the PlayStation 5 version. I've now completed the PlayStation 5 version, and what are my thoughts as to whether or not Bleak Faith Forsaken is ready for consoles? I think that it's at a point right now where it's probably in the 7 out of 10 kind of range, and the vast majority of things that keep that score down are things like the lack of polish. There are some strange situations where a specific boss move or something won't have any sound to it. That's kind of odd. There are some cutscenes that all of a sudden the text gets tiny and you can't really read it. So there are still some little glitches, some little things that need to be ironed out in order to bring up that score. But in terms of the soundtrack, in terms of the art, in terms of the style of Bleak Faith Forsaken, it's really unlike any other game I've played. It's definitely got its own style to it that you can't get from another similar action RPG. There are certainly elements to the game that need to be brushed up, and I do think that the gameplay has gotten to the point where it is fun enough to let you carry through to see all these amazing things and these great ideas. The other thing I think that people should really know about this, and it's why I started with who the developers are and some of the issues that have been corrected, is that this is something that the developers are 100% invested into. They've spent the last year plus improving this game, taking feedback, making it better, getting to a point where you can bring it to consoles at home and not be, thrown out of the PlayStation Store or something, or have people just telling you it's a bad game. It has come a monstrously large way in 1 year, and they're not going to stop developing it anytime soon. There is a very good interview with the main developer by Fioth.
When you're designing mechanics and things, it's very important to listen to players and to player feedback. When you're designing the world, it's not.
And I will link that. I'll put the card up in the corner. But it's really great to hear from the developer where they're at, where they want to see the game going, some different concessions they had to make. But they've made some really smart decisions and smart concessions to get this game to a point where it's definitely an enjoyable experience and it is worthy of your purchase on console. The game isn't a 10 out of 10 yet, but the thing is that when you purchase this game, I think it's $35 on the home consoles. It's not a full price game. It is a full length game. It'll probably take you on your first playthrough somewhere between 15 to 18 hours to play through, depending on whether or not you get stuck in certain areas, because it can be difficult to get your bearings on where you're going or to find certain areas. They kind of tuck things into corners, so you really have to scour the places, clear them out, if you're not using any kind of guide or help. So a full-length playthrough, 15 to 18 hours, tons of content, huge maps, plenty of bosses, cool interactions, lots of forward-thinking things you won't find in any other game. And I think that makes for a pretty compelling package, particularly if you're interested in this Souls-like type of combat and gameplay. Now, there are some things that are very different from Souls-likes. They have done away with losing any type of experience or anything when you die, so there's no penalty for death, except that there are certain items that you need for progression, which you will drop if you don't get them back to your version of the bonfire in this game, which is the homunculus. But other than that, there's no penalty for dying. Levels happen automatically, so you get a certain amount of experience, you pass the threshold for level, you get the level up, and then you can go into your menus and put your attributes where you want them. And gear plays a huge role in this game. When the game first released, there weren't levels at all. It literally came down to gear, so you'd actually happen upon a set of gear that was super, super strong, and it felt like you went from level 1 to level 50 instantly just by putting that gear on. It's still a big upgrade when you get good gear, but it's definitely not the same. And the fact that you have the levels on your character to build them out, to kind of customize them. Do you want more intellect? Do you want more strength? Do you want more agility? So there's more customization with it. There's more build diversity with it. And I think it was a smart decision overall. In terms of what I'd like to see from Bleak Faith Forsaken going from here, a few things are, again, get that polish in there. There are some things that really should have some kind of sound effects on them. I do want them to continue to work with the combat. There are sections where when you get a critical on an enemy and it actually cuts off a limb or a head or something, it does seem to have like a slowdown camera. I don't know if that's intentional or it's just all of a sudden creating that separate polygon that's slowing down the game. There are some areas with some frame rate drops even on PS5. That's something that could be ironed out over time. There's already one patch. I'm not sure what it's for, but this is day 2 of the game and it already has a patch on PS5. So rest assured, this team is going to continue to work on this game. This is their labor of love. And I think that's one thing that's worth buying into if you like this genre of game. But let me know in the comments down below. Are you trying out Bleak Faith Forsaken? Are you picking it up on home console or PC? And what do you want to see from the developers going forward? But until next time, this is Pirates for Pirates Gaming saying thank you for watching, and I will see you there.